I stood in the doorway of my own mountain cabin, the freezing aspen wind cutting through my designer coat, staring at a scene that would shatter everything I thought I knew about family loyalty. My younger sister Chloe, wineglass in hand, turned to face me with eyes full of contempt rather than surprise. The words that came out of her mouth next would change both our lives forever. "Oh God, this parasite is back! Get out of here before I call security!" She shrieked, her voice dripping with venom. Behind her, 7 members of the Davies family, my sister's in-laws, lounged on my furniture, surrounded by the picked-over remains of my expensive champagne and the turkey I'd been saving. But what caught my eye and stopped my heart was the family photo above the fireplace. Mine was gone, replaced by theirs. If you're wondering how someone could treat their own sister this way, stick around because this story gets even more unbelievable. And if you've ever dealt with toxic family members who took advantage of your kindness, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment about your experience. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this ends. Let me take you back to where this nightmare actually began 5 years before that Christmas Eve confrontation. I was 32 when I made my first million in real estate development. It took 9 years of 70-hour weeks, starting as a junior analyst in Denver and working my way up through sheer determination. My mentor, Robert Chin, taught me everything about reading markets and closing deals. By the time I hit that milestone, I'd earned every dollar through sacrifice and relentless focus on my career. My parents, Michael and Sarah, had been school teachers. Good, honest people who'd raised Chloe and me in a modest 3-bedroom ranch house in suburban Denver, teaching us the value of hard work and education. They'd scrimped and saved to help with my college tuition, though I'd still graduated with $40,000 in student loans. When they'd died in that car accident on I-70 hit by a drunk driver on a rainy October evening, it had shattered my world in ways I'm still processing years later. I was 28. Chloe was 23, just graduated from college with a degree in communications and no clear career direction. The insurance settlement had been $200,000 split evenly between us. I'd taken my $100,000 and after paying off my student loans and my modest car loan, used the remaining $75,000 as a down payment on a small commercial property in an up-and-coming neighborhood. It was a calculated risk, but Robert had taught me to see potential where others saw problems. Chloe had spent her $100,000 on a wedding, not just any wedding. A 30-guest destination wedding in Cabo San Lucas, complete with a beachfront ceremony, a reception at a 5-star resort, designer dress professional photographer, videographer, and a honeymoon in Bora Bora. When I'd gently suggested maybe setting some aside for a house down payment or emergency fund, she'd looked at me like I'd suggested she skip the wedding entirely. "This is my dream wedding, Natalie," she'd said, using my full name, even though everyone called me Eleanor. Mom and Dad would have wanted me to be happy, and Mark is the one. I know it. Mark Davies. I'd met him exactly twice before the wedding. He was handsome in a conventional way, tall with sandy hair and an easy smile that seemed to charm everyone he met. He worked in pharmaceutical sales, which sounded impressive until you learned he'd been with 3 different companies in 2 years, always moving on just before his probationary period ended. He talked constantly about upcoming promotions, big commissions just around the corner, connections that were going to pay off any day now. Red flags in retrospect. But Chloe had been so happy and I'd been so deep in grief over losing our parents that I'd convinced myself to be supportive. She was my baby sister. Our parents were gone. We were all each other had left. The wedding had been beautiful. I'd given a toast about how proud Mom and Dad would have been, and I'd meant it even as I'd watched Chloe's $100,000 being spent on flower arrangements and champagne towers and a 7-tier cake that most guests didn't even eat. 6 months later, Chloe had called me crying. They were living in Mark's studio apartment, barely big enough for 1 person, let alone 2. Mark's commission check had been smaller than expected. Again! They couldn't afford to move to a decent place, and living in such close quarters was straining their marriage. Could I help them look for an apartment? I'd spent 3 weekends touring rentals with them using my professional network and knowledge of the Denver market. I'd found them a beautiful 2-bedroom in Capitol Hill, newly renovated hardwood floors, lots of natural light, close to restaurants and shops. Market rent was $2,500 a month, which was actually reasonable for the location and quality. When Mark had blanched at the price I'd made what I thought was a generous offer, The building owner was one of my professional contacts, someone I'd helped secure financing on another project. I could negotiate a friends and family discount, maybe get it down to $2,000. I'd also offered to cover the security deposit and first month's rent as a wedding gift I hadn't been able to afford at the time of their actual wedding. But even $2,000 had been a stretch for them. Mark's base salary was barely $40,000, and his commissions were sporadic at best. Chloe had been working as a receptionist at a dental office making $30,000. After taxes, they were bringing home maybe $4,000 a month. $2,000 for rent would have left them uncomfortably tight. That's when I'd made my first major mistake. What if I bought the building? I'd suggested, thinking out loud. It was a small 4-unit building, and the owner had mentioned he might be interested in selling in the next year or two. It could be a good investment property for me, and you two could live there. I'd charge you just enough to cover the mortgage and maintenance, maybe $1,200 a month. Chloe had thrown her arms around me, sobbing with gratitude. Mark had shaken my hand, thanking me profusely, promising they'd pay me back for all of this once his career took off. The building had cost me $400,000, my first major property purchase. I'd put down $80,000, taking out a mortgage for the rest. The other 3 units I'd rented out at market rate, which more than covered the mortgage and gave me a small profit each month. On paper, it was a sound investment. But from the beginning, Chloe and Mark's unit had been a problem. The $1,200 I'd agreed to charge them barely covered the property tax allocation and utilities for their unit. I wasn't making money off them, but I wasn't losing money either, or so I'd told myself. What I'd failed to account for was the opportunity cost. If I'd rented their unit at market rate like the others, I could have been bringing in an extra $1,300 per month. Over 5 years, that was $78,000 in foregone income. But that was just the beginning. 2 months after they'd moved in, Chloe had called again. They didn't have furniture. Could I help? They'd sold most of Mark's studio apartment furniture before the move, expecting to upgrade, but now they couldn't afford it. They were sleeping on an air mattress and eating takeout because they didn't have a dining table. I'd given Chloe my credit card and told her to furnish the apartment. Within reason, I'd said. Basic furniture, nothing too expensive. She'd spent $8,000. When the credit card bill had arrived, I'd nearly choked. A designer sectional sofa for $3,500. A reclaimed wood dining table for $2,000. A king-sized bed frame and mattress set for $2,200. Decorative items, lamps, rugs, artwork. It was beautiful furniture, the kind I'd love to own myself, but it wasn't what I'd meant by basic. When I'd called to ask about it, Chloe had been defensive. You said to furnish the apartment. This is a nice place, Natalie. We can't have cheap furniture in it. It would look terrible. Plus, Mark's parents are coming to visit next month, and I want to make a good impression. I'd swallowed my frustration and paid the bill. It was my fault for not being more specific, I'd told myself. And it was done now. At least they were settled. Mark's parents' visit had been my introduction to the Davies family dynamics, and it should have been another red flag. Richard and Patricia Davies had arrived on a Friday evening in November, driving up from Colorado Springs, where they'd been living in a retirement community. Richard was a retired insurance adjuster, Patricia a former bank teller. They seemed nice enough at first, polite and friendly, though I'd noticed how quickly they'd inspected every corner of Chloe and Mark's apartment, commenting on the quality of the furniture and the desirability of the neighborhood. Chloe had invited me to dinner that night, wanting me to meet Mark's parents properly. I'd brought an expensive bottle of wine and a bouquet of flowers, trying to make a good impression. The evening had started pleasantly enough. Patricia had complimented my outfit, a simple but elegant wrap dress I'd worn to a client meeting earlier that day. Richard had asked about my work, seeming genuinely interested in the real estate development business. But as the wine had flowed and the conversation had continued, things had shifted. Patricia had started asking increasingly pointed questions about my income, my assets, my investments. How much had I made on my first property flip? What was my net worth now? Did I have a financial advisor? I'd deflected politely, uncomfortable with the interrogation, but then Richard had leaned forward, his face flushed with wine, and said something I should have paid more attention to. You know, Eleanor, you've done very well for yourself, better than most people your age, and it's wonderful how you're helping Mark and Chloe get started. Family should help family, don't you think? We certainly would do the same if we were in a position to. The implication had been clear. They weren't in a position to help their own son, so they expected me to do it. I'd smiled and changed the subject, but the comment had lodged itself in my brain like a splinter. Later that night after I'd gone home, Chloe had called me. "Mark's parents loved you," she'd gushed. "They said you're exactly the kind of family they'd hoped Mark would marry into." "But Mark married you, not me," I'd pointed out, confused. "You know what I mean. They're just happy that you're in our lives, that we have someone successful to lean on." Someone successful to lean on. Not someone to love and support mutually, but someone to extract resources from. I'd pushed the thought away as uncharitable. The holidays that year had been my next test. Chloe had wanted to host Thanksgiving, her first as a married woman in her own place. She'd invited me Mark's parents, Mark's brother Thomas and his wife Jennifer, and Mark's sister Amanda. 8 people total. I'd offered to bring dishes, but Chloe had insisted she wanted to cook everything herself. It was important to her to prove she could host to show Mark's family she was capable and domestic. 2 days before Thanksgiving, she'd called in a panic. The grocery bill was going to be over $300. She couldn't afford it. Mark's commission check had been delayed again. Could I help? I'd sent her $400 via Venmo, telling myself it was a holiday gift. Everyone overspends on holidays. Then the day before Thanksgiving, another call. Her oven had broken. The landlord, who was technically me through my property management company, needed to send a repairman, but he couldn't come until the following week. Could I possibly pay for her to rent a commercial kitchen space for the day, or maybe help her buy a new countertop convection oven? I'd authorized an emergency repair, paying double time to get a technician out there on Thanksgiving morning. Cost $500. Thanksgiving dinner had been lovely. Chloe had cooked a beautiful meal, and everyone had been warm and complimentary. But I'd noticed how Mark's family had treated her with a kind of surprised approval, as if they'd expected her to fail. And I'd noticed how when Patricia had asked Chloe how she'd managed to pull off such an elaborate meal on Mark's salary, Chloe had just smiled mysteriously and said, "We make it work." She hadn't mentioned my $700 in contributions, the below-market rent, or any of the other ways I'd been subsidizing their life. After dinner, Richard had pulled me aside. "Eleanor, could I talk to you privately for a moment?" We'd stepped out onto the apartment balcony, the November air crisp and cold. Richard had lit a cigarette, offering me one, which I'd declined. "I wanted to thank you," he'd said, exhaling smoke into the night air, "for everything you're doing for Mark and Chloe. I know you're helping them with the rent and probably other things too. Patricia and I, we're not in a position to help much right now. We had some financial setbacks a few years back. Medical bills, some bad investments. We're living on Social Security and a small pension, and it's tight." "I'm sorry to hear that," I'd said, genuinely sympathetic. "The thing is," Richard had continued, "Patricia has some health issues. She needs to see specialists regularly, and some of them are in Denver. The drive from Colorado Springs is getting hard on her. We've been thinking about moving closer, but everything in Denver is so expensive." I'd felt the trap closing, but couldn't see a way out that didn't make me look heartless. "That must be difficult." "I don't suppose," Richard had said, his voice casual, but his eyes sharp. "You know of any affordable rentals? Something small, just a 1-bedroom. We wouldn't need much, and having us closer would be good for Mark and Chloe, don't you think? We could help with babysitting when they have kids, be more involved." I'd made a non-committal noise, said I'd keep an eye out, and changed the subject as quickly as possible. But the seed had been planted. Over the next few months, Chloe had brought up her in-laws' housing situation repeatedly. They were so far away. Patricia's health was getting worse. The drive was too much for them. It would be so wonderful if they could be closer. Finally, I'd caved. Using my professional network, I'd found Richard and Patricia a 1-bedroom apartment in a senior-friendly building in Capitol Hill, not far from Chloe and Mark. The rent was $1,500 a month, which was actually below market for the area and the building's amenities. But Richard and Patricia could only afford $1,000. I'd personally guaranteed their lease, promising the landlord I'd cover any shortfalls or damages. I'd also quietly arranged for a subsidy that brought their rent down to what they could afford. Cost to me $500 per month or $6,000 per year. At the time, I'd justified it as an investment in family harmony. Having Mark's parents close by would help Chloe and Mark's marriage. It would give them a support system. And if it made Patricia's medical care easier, wasn't that a good thing? But within a month of Richard and Patricia moving in, the dynamic had shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated. Suddenly, every family gathering included Mark's parents. Every holiday, every birthday, every casual Sunday brunch. And with Richard and Patricia came expectations. They'd mentioned needing help with various expenses always directed at me through Chloe. Their car needed new tires. Their prescriptions were expensive. The apartment's heating bill was higher than expected. I'd started writing checks telling myself each time would be the last, that I was just helping them get settled. Then had come the car situation, the one that would eventually become the most visible symbol of my own foolishness. It was March, about 18 months after Richard and Patricia had moved to Denver. Chloe had called me on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice thick with tears. Patricia had fallen in their apartment building, nothing serious, but it had scared everyone. She needed to see a specialist at University Hospital for follow-up tests. Richard couldn't drive her because his cataracts had gotten worse, and he was waiting for surgery. Chloe and Mark both worked during the day and couldn't take that much time off. Could I help? I'd taken Patricia to 3 appointments, rearranging my work schedule each time. She'd been sweet and grateful, talking about her grandchildren she hoped to have someday. How wonderful it was to have a daughter-in-law like Chloe. How lucky Mark was to have married into such a caring family. It's just so hard not having reliable transportation, Patricia had sighed during one drive. Richard and I have been talking about selling our car and just using rideshare services, but those add up quickly, and it's hard to plan around, but we'll manage. We always do. The next time I'd seen Chloe, she'd brought it up more directly. Mark's parents are really struggling with the transportation thing. I feel so bad for them. Patricia's afraid she's going to miss important medical appointments because they can't get there reliably, and Richard's surgery got pushed back another 2 months. What about Mark? I'd asked. Can't he take time off to drive them? Chloe's face had tightened. Mark's already on thin ice at work. He's missed too many days. If he takes any more time off, they might let him go. And then where would we be? Where would we be? Not where would they be, but we, as if their financial situation was somehow my responsibility. What if we looked into medical transport services? I'd suggested. There are companies that specialize in driving people to medical appointments. Those cost money too, Chloe had pointed out. And they're not always reliable. Sometimes they're late or they cancel. Patricia gets anxious about being late for her appointments. The conversation had circled for another 20 minutes, with Chloe finding problems with every solution I'd proposed until finally I'd seen where it was heading. Are you asking me to buy them a car? I'd said bluntly. Chloe had looked away, her face flushing. I'm not asking anything. I'm just worried about them. They're family now, and Patricia is getting worse. She needs consistent care. A new car costs tens of thousands of dollars, Chloe. Not a new car, just something reliable, maybe a used SUV. Something safe with good safety ratings. Patricia needs something with a higher seat because of her mobility issues, and it would need to be good in snow for the winter. I'd felt manipulated but also genuinely concerned for Patricia's health. Let me think about it, I'd said. 2 weeks later, Chloe had sent me a listing for a 3-year-old white Honda CR-V. Low mileage, excellent condition, certified pre-owned, $28,000. This would be perfect, her text had read. I showed it to Richard and Patricia and they loved it. It checks all the boxes for Patricia's needs. You showed it to them already before even discussing it with me, but I hadn't said that. Instead, I'd done research, confirmed it was a fair price, and made arrangements to see the car. Chloe, Mark, Richard, and Patricia had all come along, and I'd felt like a parent buying their teenager their first car. Everyone had been excited, pointing out features, talking about road trips they could take, how much easier life would be. I'd written a check for the down payment, $10,000, and set up a finance plan for the remaining $18,000. The monthly payment was $347. We'll pay you back for the down payment, Mark had promised. And we'll take over the payments as soon as my next big commission comes through. This is just temporary. I'd nodded, wanting to believe it, even as a voice in my head had whispered that I'd never see that money again. The car had been registered in my name because my credit score was better, which meant lower interest rates. The insurance had also been in my name, adding another $160 to my monthly expenses. But it was supposed to be temporary, I'd told myself. Just until they got on their feet. That had been 2 years ago. I'd never received a single payment from Mark or his parents. Every time I'd brought it up, there had been another excuse. Mark's commission check had been delayed. Patricia's medical bills had been higher than expected. Richard's cataract surgery had cost more than insurance covered. The timing just wasn't right, but soon, definitely soon. In the meantime, I'd paid $47,000 for a car I never drove for people who now seemed to feel entitled to it. But the car was just the most expensive example of a pattern that had been repeating for years. There had been emergency loans that were never repaid, temporary help with utility bills that became permanent, gifts for birthdays and holidays that had somehow become expected rather than appreciated. I'd tracked it all carefully in a spreadsheet, a habit from my business training. By the time of that fateful Christmas, I'd calculated that I'd spent or forgone income totaling $512,000 over 5 years, more than $500,000, all in the name of being a good sister and helping family. My friends had started to notice and comment. My best friend Rachel, whom I'd known since college, had been increasingly vocal about her concerns. "Eleanor, you need to stop," she'd said over lunch about 6 months before the Christmas incident. "Chloe is using you. Can't you see that?" "She's my sister," I'd said, the automatic defense I'd developed. "Family helps family." "Family goes both ways," Rachel had countered. "What has Chloe done for you lately? When was the last time she asked how you were doing? When was the last time she was there for you?" I'd opened my mouth to respond and realized I couldn't think of an example. Not one. "Exactly," Rachel had said, seeing my silence. "You're not in a reciprocal relationship with your sister. You're in an extraction relationship. She extracts resources from you, money, time, emotional energy, and you get nothing back except demands for more." "That's harsh," I'd said, but the words had stung because they felt true. "It's honest," Rachel had corrected. "And someone needs to be honest with you because Chloe sure isn't. Neither is Mark or his parents. They're all happy to keep taking as long as you keep giving." I'd changed the subject, uncomfortable with the truth Rachel was speaking. But her words had stayed with me, a persistent whisper I couldn't quite silence. A few months later, something had happened that should have been my wake-up call. I'd been going through a particularly difficult time at work. A major development project I'd been leading, a mixed-use complex in an up-and-coming neighborhood, had hit major complications. The primary investor had pulled out unexpectedly, leaving us scrambling to find replacement financing. I'd been working 18-hour days, stressed to the point of barely sleeping, worried I might lose not just the deal, but my reputation in the industry. One particularly bad evening in October, I'd been sitting in my office at 11 p.m., staring at financial models that weren't working when I'd felt something break inside me. I'd started crying, really crying for the first time since my parents' funeral. All the pressure, all the loneliness, all the sacrifices I'd made to build my career came flooding out. I'd needed someone to talk to, someone to remind me why I'd chosen this path and that I had value beyond my bank account. I'd called Chloe. She'd answered on the 4th ring, sounding distracted. "Hey, what's up? This isn't a great time." "I'm having a really hard time," I'd said, my voice shaking. "Is there any way we could talk, maybe grab coffee tomorrow?" "Is this about money?" Chloe had asked, her tone shifting to wariness. "Because if you're calling to ask about when we can start paying you back for things I told you, Mark's situation is complicated right now." "No, it's not about money. I just need someone to talk to. I'm going through something difficult at work and—" "Oh, work stuff." Chloe had interrupted, her tone dismissive. "Well, I'm sure you'll figure it out. You always do. You're like super competent at that business stuff. Hey, while I have you on the phone though, can I ask you something?" The shift had been so abrupt, it had taken me a moment to process. "I guess. So Patricia's birthday is next week, and Mark and I want to do something special for her. She's been talking about this spa resort in Boulder, the one with the hot springs. We were thinking of booking her a weekend package there, but it's kind of expensive, like $800. Would you be willing to chip in maybe half? It would mean so much to her." I'd sat there, phone pressed to my ear, tears still wet on my face, and felt something inside me go numb. "I need to go," I'd said quietly. "I have more work to do." "Oh, okay, but about the spa thing." I'd hung up. For 3 days afterward, Chloe hadn't called or texted to check on me, not once. But on the 4th day, I'd received a text. "Hey, so I need to know about the spa package soon because they book up fast. Can you Venmo me $400 by Friday?" I'd sent the money. I don't know why. Habit, maybe. Or some desperate hope that if I kept giving, eventually Chloe would realize I needed something back. She'd sent a thumbs up emoji in response. That was it. Rachel had been right. I'd been in an extraction relationship, but knowing it and doing something about it were two different things. I'd been trapped by a combination of guilt hope and the sunk cost fallacy. I'd already invested so much in this relationship. How could I walk away now? But the universe, or fate, or whatever you want to call it, was about to make that decision for me. The Christmas vacation had been something I'd been looking forward to for months. After the stress of the development deal, which I'd managed to salvage, though it had taken years off my life, I'd needed true solitude. Not a weekend getaway, but a full week of complete disconnection. I'd told no one about my plans. Not Rachel, not my assistant, not even the property management company that handled my mountain cabin. I'd simply put an out-of-office message on my email, silenced my phone, and driven north into the mountains. The cabin was my sanctuary, a place I'd bought 3 years earlier with my first major profit from a property flip. It was remote accessible only by a winding mountain road that became treacherous in winter. 3 bedrooms, huge windows overlooking the valley, a stone fireplace that could heat the entire main floor, and most importantly, no neighbors within 2 miles. I'd stocked up on groceries, bought a stack of books I'd been meaning to read, downloaded some movies onto my laptop, and planned to do absolutely nothing but rest, think, and remember who I was outside of being everyone's financial solution. The drive up had been beautiful. Fresh snow had fallen the night before, transforming the landscape into something magical. I'd stopped at a local market in a small town about an hour from the cabin, picking up some local wine, artisanal cheese, and the ingredients for the elaborate Christmas dinner I'd planned to cook just for myself. I'd even bought a small turkey, planning to roast it slowly, filling the cabin with the smell of herbs and butter. As I'd driven the final stretch of winding road to my cabin, I'd felt the knot in my shoulders beginning to loosen. A week of this, I'd thought. A week of peace and quiet and being completely alone. It was exactly what I needed. Then I'd seen the vehicles. At first, I'd thought I was at the wrong cabin. But no, this was my driveway, my address on the hand-carved wooden sign my father had made for me as a housewarming gift. And parked in my driveway, as bold as brass, was the white Honda CR-V. The one I'd bought. The one I was still making payments on. The one that was supposed to be for Patricia's medical appointments. Next to it was a silver sedan I didn't recognize, presumably belonging to other members of the Davies family. My first emotion was confusion. Why would they be here? How did they even know about this place? I'd never told Chloe the exact location, only mentioned in passing that I had a mountain property somewhere near Aspen. My confusion turned to unease as I'd approached the front door. Music was blasting from inside, loud rock music that seemed incongruous with the peaceful mountain setting. I could hear laughter, the kind of loud, uninhibited laughter that comes from people who've been drinking for hours. The front door was unlocked. I'd stood there for a long moment, my hand on the doorknob, processing this information. My cabin, my remote, private sanctuary, and someone was inside doors, unlocked, partying. In my glove compartment was the 9mm handgun I always carried when traveling to remote areas. Years ago, I'd had a frightening experience during a property inspection at a vacant building. A homeless man who'd been squatting there and had become aggressive when discovered. Since then, I'd taken safety training and carried protection. But even as my hand had moved toward the glove compartment, I'd known this wasn't that kind of situation. This was something else, something that required documentation, not defense. I'd pulled out my phone and started recording before I'd pushed open the door. The blast of heat and noise that had hit me when I'd opened that door was my first glimpse of the violation. My cabin, which I'd left pristine and peaceful just 3 weeks earlier, had been transformed into what looked like the aftermath of a fraternity party. The living room was packed with people. Chloe and Mark, obviously, but also Richard and Patricia Davies, Mark's brother Thomas, and his wife Jennifer, Mark's sister Amanda, and her husband Steve, and even 2 teenagers I vaguely recognized as Amanda's kids from her first marriage. My expensive leather furniture had been rearranged to accommodate everyone. My carefully curated minimalist decor had been buried under tacky holiday decorations, the kind you buy in bulk at discount stores. Garish tinsel inflatable snowmen, lights everywhere. The coffee table was covered with the debris of a feast, picked over turkey bones. Empty champagne bottles, wine-stained glasses, plates with congealing gravy. But what had made my blood run truly cold was the fireplace. Above the mantel where I'd kept a silver-framed photo of my parents taken the Christmas before they died, there was now a professional portrait of the Davies family, all of them dressed in matching cream sweaters, smiling broadly. The photo was in an ornate gold frame, the kind that costs $200 at a specialty framing shop. My parents' photo was nowhere to be seen. I'd stood there still recording, taking in every detail. No one had noticed me yet. They were too busy laughing at something Richard was saying, too deep in their celebration of what they'd apparently decided was their family holiday. Then Mark had turned to grab another drink from the kitchen and had seen me. The look on his face was almost comical. His eyes had gone wide, his mouth falling open, the color draining from his face so quickly I'd thought he might faint. He'd frozen completely, his hand still outstretched toward the wine bottle. "Eleanor." He'd croaked the single word loud enough to cut through the music and conversation. Everyone had turned to look. Chloe's face, when she'd registered my presence, had gone through a rapid series of expressions. Surprise, guilt, fear, and then shockingly annoyance. Not shame or apology, but irritation at my interruption. She'd set down her wine glass, a heavy crystal glass from a set I'd purchased during a trip to France last year, and put her hands on her hips. "Oh God, this parasite is back," she'd said, her words slurring slightly from alcohol. "Get out of here before I call security." The room had gone silent except for the music still blaring from my sound system. 7 pairs of Davy's eyes had turned to stare at me. Patricia had at least had the grace to look mortified, her hand flying to her mouth. Richard's face had gone red. Amanda and Thomas had exchanged uncomfortable glances. But Chloe had just stood there swaying slightly, glaring at me with undisguised hostility. I'd kept recording my hand steady despite the rage building in my chest. "Say that again, Chloe," I'd said, my voice eerily calm. "I want to make sure I heard you correctly." "You heard me." She'd spat, emboldened by alcohol and the presence of Mark's family. "This is our family Christmas. Mark's family, you weren't invited. So why don't you crawl back to whatever rock you came from and leave us alone for once?" The phrase, "our family Christmas," had echoed in my head, in my cabin, using my furniture, my dishes, my food, and wine. After replacing my parents' photo with theirs. "Interesting," I'd said, my voice dangerously soft. "Our family Christmas. In my house, drinking my wine." I'd walked to the counter and picked up one of the empty champagne bottles, holding it up to the camera, still recording on my phone. "This is a 2015 Bollinger. I paid $340 for this bottle. It was supposed to be for a special occasion." I'd set it down and picked up another empty. "This is Dom Perignon, $280. I see there are 5 empty bottles here. That's over $1,500 in champagne alone." Chloe's face had flushed an ugly red. "Stop being so dramatic. It's just alcohol." "You're right," I'd agreed. "It's just alcohol. Just like this is just my house, and those are just my belongings, and that is just my parents' photograph that you removed and replaced with yours." Mark had finally unfrozen enough to try to salvage the situation. "Eleanor, look, we can explain," he'd stammered, moving toward me with his hands raised placatingly. "Chloe said you weren't going to use the cabin this year, and with Patricia's health issues, we thought it would be good to have a family gathering somewhere quiet and restful, and we figured you wouldn't mind, and we were going to clean everything up before you ever knew we were here." I'd turned to Chloe, my eyebrows raised. "I said I wasn't going to use the cabin this year. That's interesting, considering I've never told you where this cabin is located." Chloe had shifted uncomfortably. "You mentioned Aspen once. And I found the address in your phone when you left it on the table during lunch a few months ago." "You went through my phone. I needed to text myself from it because my battery was dead and I didn't remember your number," Chloe had said defensively. "And I saw the address in your maps history. I didn't think it was a big deal." "Right," I'd said slowly. "So you snooped through my phone, found the address of a property I deliberately didn't share with you, and decided to throw a party here without asking. That's the story you're going with." "It's not like we're hurting anything," Chloe had shouted, her defensive attitude cracking into aggression. "God, you're so uptight about everything? It's just a house, Natalie, a house you barely use. We thought we'd get some enjoyment out of it since you're too busy being a workaholic to actually live your life." The use of my legal first name instead of my chosen name, Eleanor, felt like another small violation. "And my parents' photograph." "What about it?" Chloe had snapped. "Where is it?" She'd gestured vaguely toward the kitchen. It's in a drawer somewhere. We needed the space for our family photo. This is Mark's family Christmas. We wanted it to feel like our place, not yours. Something in me had snapped at that moment, not broken, but crystallized into diamond-hard clarity. Everyone needs to leave, I'd said quietly, right now. Richard had stood up, his face a mixture of embarrassment and attempted diplomacy. Miss Eleanor, please, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. If we'd known you were coming. If you'd known I was coming to my own house, I'd interrupted. You would have what, not broken in? We didn't break in, Chloe had shrieked. The door was unlocked. The door was locked, I'd corrected her. I always lock it, so how did you get in? The guilty silence had been answer enough. Someone had broken a window or picked a lock. I'd find out which later. Everyone out, I'd repeated. You have 30 minutes to gather your things and leave. You can't do this, Chloe had shouted, her face contorted with anger. It's Christmas Eve. There's a blizzard warning. Where are we supposed to go? I don't care, I'd said simply. You should have thought of that before you broke into my house, drank my expensive champagne, and called me a parasite. Now get out. You absolute bitch, Chloe had hissed. You're really going to throw your own sister out into a snowstorm on Christmas Eve. What kind of monster are you? I'd looked at her, really looked at her, and realized I was looking at a stranger. When had my sweet baby sister, the girl who used to follow me around begging to play dolls, turned into this entitled, vicious person standing before me? I'm calling the police, Chloe had announced, pulling out her phone. You can't do this. This is harassment. This is abuse. I'm calling them right now and telling them you're threatening us. Please do, I'd said calmly. I would love to speak with law enforcement about this situation. While you're at it, make sure to mention how you found the address by going through my phone without permission, how you entered a locked property without authorization, and how you destroyed property by removing family photographs. Chloe had dialed 911, and I'd simply waited, still recording everything. The conversation with the 911 dispatcher had been almost entertaining in its desperation. Chloe had claimed I'd forced my way into a family gathering and was threatening everyone. She'd painted herself as the victim, her voice taking on a tearful, frightened quality that would have been convincing if I hadn't known the truth. When the dispatcher had asked for the address, Chloe had rattled it off confidently. Then the dispatcher had asked whose name the property was registered under. I'd watched Chloe's face as she'd realized her mistake. It's complicated, she'd said. It's a family property. Is it registered in your name? The dispatcher had asked. No, but is it registered in the name of anyone currently present at the property? Chloe had looked at Mark, who'd shaken his head. My sister's name, Chloe had finally admitted. But she's the one who's threatening us. The dispatcher had informed her that officers would be sent to assess the situation and had disconnected. The 20 minutes waiting for the police had been among the most uncomfortable of my life. The music had been turned off. Everyone had sat in tense silence, avoiding eye contact. Patricia had started crying quietly, and Richard had tried to comfort her while shooting me reproachful looks. Mark's siblings had begun whispering among themselves, clearly uncomfortable and unsure what to do. Their teenage kids had been glued to their phones, probably texting their friends about the crazy Christmas drama. Chloe had continued to glare at me with pure hatred, occasionally muttering under her breath about what a terrible sister I was, how I'd always been jealous of her, how I was a controlling, cold-hearted bitch who had never really loved her. I'd ignored all of it, standing by the window, watching for the police cars, my phone still recording everything. When the 2 sheriff's deputies had finally arrived, their SUV lights casting red and blue across the snow, I'd felt a wave of relief. Chloe had immediately launched into her story the moment they'd walked through the door. She'd spun an elaborate tale about how this was a family cabin, that I had unreasonable restrictions about how she and Mark had arranged to use it with the understanding that I wouldn't be here, how I'd shown up unexpectedly and immediately started threatening everyone. She'd been crying by this point, real tears, her voice shaking with what seemed like genuine distress. My sister has always been controlling, she'd sobbed. She holds money over everyone's heads. She acts like she owns everyone just because she has more money. We're family. This is supposed to be a family property, and now she's threatening to throw us out into a blizzard just because she's angry we didn't ask permission. It had been a compelling performance. If I'd been a stranger listening, I might have believed her. The older deputy, whose name tag read Morrison, had listened patiently, taking notes. Then he'd turned to me. "Ma'am, do you own this property?" "I do," I'd said calmly. "Can you provide documentation?" I'd walked to my car without a word, retrieved my folder from the glove compartment, and returned with my property deed, tax bills, utility statements, and insurance documentation, all with my name on them. Deputy Morrison had examined each document carefully, while his younger partner, Deputy Chin, had continued taking statements from Mark's family members. "And do these individuals have your permission to be here?" Morrison had asked me. "They do not," I'd said clearly. "I never gave permission for anyone to use this property. I was not consulted or informed of their plans to be here." Morrison had nodded, then turned to Chloe. "Ma'am, you stated this was a family property, but according to these documents, the sole owner is Eleanor Hayes. You're not listed anywhere on the deed or title." "She's my sister," Chloe had protested. "It's supposed to be for the family." "That may be your understanding," Morrison had said patiently. "But legally, Miss Hayes is the sole owner. If she didn't give you permission to be here, you're trespassing." "That's insane," Mark had interjected. "She's family. You can't trespass on family property." "Actually, sir, you can," Deputy Chin had said. "Property ownership is clearly defined by law. Family relationships don't supersede property rights." That's when I'd pulled out my phone and played the recording I'd made. I'd let them listen to Chloe calling me a parasite, telling me to get out of my own house, the whole ugly confrontation. The shift in the room had been palpable. Morrison's expression had hardened. Chin had raised his eyebrows. "Miss Hayes," Morrison had said to Chloe, "you called your sister a parasite in her own home." Chloe had paled. "I was drunk. I didn't mean it." "But you did say it," Morrison had confirmed. She'd nodded miserably. Morrison had turned back to me. "Do you want these individuals removed from your property?" "I do," I'd said firmly, immediately. "It's Christmas Eve," Patricia had whimpered from the couch. "Please, where will we go?" Morrison had looked uncomfortable but resolute. "Ma'am, that's not the property owner's responsibility. You'll need to make other arrangements." That's when Deputy Chin had raised another issue. "Before anyone leaves, I need to ask, has anyone here been drinking alcohol tonight?" The uncomfortable shuffling and lack of eye contact had been answer enough. "I'm going to need to verify that," Chin had said. "Who drove here?" Mark had raised his hand reluctantly. "I drove our car." "And the SUV?" Chin had asked. "That's my parents'," Mark had said. "My dad drove." "Have either of you had anything to drink tonight?" Both Mark and Richard had nodded. Chin had exchanged a glance with Morrison. "Then we have a problem. I can't allow you to drive if you're intoxicated. It's illegal and dangerous, especially on these mountain roads in this weather." "So what are we supposed to do?" Amanda had asked, her voice rising. "Stay here." "Absolutely not," I'd said firmly. "They're not staying in my house." Chin had sighed. "Then someone needs to arrange for sober transportation. Do any of you have anyone you can call to come pick you up?" The silence had been deafening. Finally, Richard had spoken up, his voice defeated. "I'm the least drunk. I only had 2 glasses of wine and that was hours ago. I can drive everyone." "Are you certain you're under the legal limit?" Morrison had asked. "I think so," Richard had said. Chin had produced a breathalyzer. Richard had blown into it and the result had shown he was just barely under the legal limit. Chin hadn't looked happy about it, but he'd agreed to let Richard drive, warning him sternly about the roads and the weather. That's when I'd made my move. I'd walked over to the fireplace and reached up for the Davies family portrait. Behind me, I'd heard Patricia gasp and Mark start to protest, but I'd ignored them. I'd pulled the frame down and without hesitation thrown it into the fire. The frame had caught immediately, the edges curling and blackening. The professional photo with its perfect smiles and matching sweaters had warped and blistered in the heat. Within seconds, it was unrecognizable. The room had been dead silent except for the crackle of burning wood. I'd reached into the kitchen drawer where Chloe had indicated my parents' photo was stored. I'd found it wedged behind some dish towels, the frame scratched, the glass cracked. I'd pulled it out carefully and returned it to its place on the mantel, wiping away dust with the edge of my shirt. "Now?" I'd said, turning to face the room. "You can call the police again if you'd like. Tell them my sister tried to destroy my family Christmas by replacing my deceased parents' photo with hers." Nobody had said a word. Morrison had cleared his throat. "Folks, I'm going to need you to start gathering your belongings. You have 30 minutes. The next half hour had been a flurry of activity. Mark's family had scrambled to collect their things, loading bags and boxes into the two vehicles. I'd watched from the window, making mental notes of everything they'd taken from my cabin. Several bottles of wine from my collection, a cashmere throw blanket from the master bedroom, even some of my high-end cookware. I'd let it go. The cost of the items was nothing compared to what they'd already taken from me over the years, and more importantly, I had evidence of everything on my phone recording. As they'd prepared to leave, Patricia had approached me, her eyes red from crying. "Eleanor, please," she'd said softly. "I'm so sorry. We didn't know Chloe hadn't asked permission. She told us you'd said it was fine. Please believe me. We never would have come if we'd known." I'd looked at this woman I'd helped, whose medical appointments I'd driven her to, whose apartment I'd guaranteed, whose car I'd bought, and I'd felt nothing but cold certainty. "Mrs. Davies," I'd said quietly, "you've been in Denver for 18 months. In all that time, have you once asked me how I was doing? Have you once offered to help me with anything? Have you ever shown any interest in my life beyond what I could provide for you?" She'd looked away, unable to meet my eyes. "That's what I thought," I'd said. "Please leave." One by one, they'd filed out into the cold December night. Mark's siblings had avoided my gaze. The teenagers had been glued to their phones, probably posting about this on social media. Richard had looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. Mark himself had paused at the door. "Eleanor, I'm sorry. I really am. Chloe told us you said it was okay. I should have verified with you directly. This is all my fault." "You're right," I'd said flatly. "You should have, but you didn't because it was easier to believe Chloe's lies than to do the right thing. Just like it's been easier for you to let me subsidize your life than to actually provide for your family." He'd flinched as if I'd slapped him. Chloe had been the last to leave, dragging her feet, her face a mask of defiance, barely covering her fear. At the door, she'd turned back to me one last time. "I hate you," she'd said, her voice shaking. "You're a monster. I hope you enjoy your perfect life all alone in your perfect houses with your perfect money. See how far that gets you when you're old and alone with no family." I'd met her eyes steadily. "I'll take loneliness over being used any day. Goodbye, Chloe." The door had closed behind them, and I'd stood there listening to the sounds of car doors slamming, engines starting, vehicles crunching through snow down the driveway. Then silence. I'd locked the door this time, adding the deadbolt and the chain. Then I'd walked through the cabin, assessing the damage. The kitchen was a disaster, but it was nothing some cleaning couldn't fix. The missing items I'd noted mentally. The general disarray would take a few hours to set right. I'd poured myself a glass of wine, not the expensive stuff Chloe had wasted, but a simple local red I actually enjoyed. I'd sat down in front of the fireplace, my parents' photo back in its rightful place, and I'd felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not happiness, not yet, but a deep bone-level sense of relief, as if I'd finally set down a burden I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it wasn't part of me. I'd stayed at the cabin for the rest of the week, cleaning, reading, thinking. I'd cooked my Christmas dinner on Christmas Day just for myself, and it had been the most peaceful holiday I'd had in years. During those quiet days, I'd made plans, careful, methodical plans about what would happen next. When I'd finally returned to Denver on New Year's Eve, I'd had a list of actions to take, and I'd wasted no time implementing them. The first email I'd sent was to my property manager, instructing them to adjust Chloe and Mark's rent to market rate effective immediately. $2,500 per month instead of the $1,200 they'd been paying. The email had gone out at 9 a.m. on January 1st. The second email had gone to the landlord who'd rented to Richard and Patricia Davies, informing him that I was withdrawing my guarantee and would no longer be responsible for their rent or any damages, sent at 9:15 a.m. The third had been to my auto finance company, inquiring about voluntary repossession procedures for a vehicle when the registered owner was not the primary driver, sent at 9:30 a.m. By noon on New Year's Day, the machinery of consequences was in motion. Chloe's first call had come on January 3rd, the day after the property management company had delivered the formal notice of rent increase. I'd let it go to voicemail. "Natalie, what the hell?" Her voice had been shrill, panicked. "My property manager just sent me a notice saying my rent is going up to $2,500 a month. That's more than double what we're paying now. This has to be a mistake. We can't afford that. You need to call them and fix this right now." I deleted the voicemail without responding. The second call had come 2 days later. Fine, ignore me. But you need to know that Mark's parents just got a notice from their landlord saying their rent guarantee is being withdrawn. They're freaking out, Natalie. You're the one who guaranteed them in the first place. How can you just abandon them like this? They're old. They have health problems. Where are they supposed to go? I deleted that voicemail too. The third call had come a week later, Chloe's voice now tinged with desperation rather than anger. Natalie, please pick up. I know you're angry about Christmas and you have every right to be. I was drunk, I said terrible things, I'm sorry. But you can't punish Mark's parents for what I did. They're innocent in all this. Please just call me back. We need to talk. I'd listened to that one all the way through, then blocked her number. But I hadn't stopped there. I'd had one more call to make, and this one was the most important. I'd sat at my desk with a glass of scotch, pulled out my phone, and dialed a number I'd found through my professional network. It had rung 3 times before a professional female voice had answered. Miller Investigations, how can I help you? I'd like to hire a private investigator, I'd said calmly. I need a comprehensive background check and current activity report on someone. What's the nature of the investigation? Fraud, potential embezzlement, and identity theft. There had been a pause. That's serious. Are you considering legal action? Possibly, I'd said. But first, I need to know exactly what I'm dealing with. I'd provided Chloe's name, date of birth address, and social security number. I'd authorized an unlimited budget for the investigation. I wanted everything. Every financial transaction, every social media post, every person she'd contacted asking for money. Detective Sarah Miller had been thorough. Over the next 3 weeks, she'd compiled a report that had made me physically ill to read. The charity fraud had been the worst of it. Chloe had established something called the Hayes Family Memorial Foundation 2 years ago, supposedly to help families dealing with sudden loss in honor of our parents. She'd registered it as a 501c3 nonprofit using my professional reputation to lend it credibility. She'd even listed me as an advisory board member on the website without my knowledge or permission. The foundation's website had featured photos of our parents' sob story copy about the tragedy of losing loved ones unexpectedly and a PayPal donation button. Over 18 months, she'd collected $47,000 in donations. Detective Miller had obtained the foundation's bank records through means I'd decided not to ask about. Of the $47,000 collected, less than $2,000 had gone to anything resembling charitable work. 1 donation to a grief counseling service. The rest, credit card payments, student loan payments, luxury purchases, vacation rentals, spa treatments, restaurant bills. She'd been living off money donated in our parents' names. But that wasn't all. Miller had also discovered that Chloe had been borrowing money from people in my professional network, using our relationship to establish trust. 3 different colleagues, people I'd worked with on various deals, had lent her money over the past 2 years. James Brennan, a commercial real estate agent, had loaned her $5,000 when she'd told him she needed emergency dental work and that I would vouch for her. He'd never asked me, assuming our relationship made it a safe loan. Melissa Wong, an investor I'd partnered with on several projects, had loaned Chloe $8,000 for what Chloe had claimed was seed money for a catering business she was starting again using my name for credibility. Robert Chin, my old mentor, had actually called me to verify before agreeing to loan Chloe $15,000 for what she'd said was medical bills for Patricia. I'd been in the middle of the crisis with my development deal and had barely listened to his call, distracted and stressed. I'd mumbled something that Robert had taken as confirmation, and he'd made the loan. None of them had been repaid. All of them had been too embarrassed to tell me they'd been scammed, afraid it would damage their professional relationship with me. Detective Miller's report had gone on for 43 pages, documenting a pattern of deception, manipulation, and fraud that had been going on for years right under my nose. I'd sat in my office reading it, feeling a strange mixture of emotions. Rage, yes, but also a kind of vindication. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. Chloe hadn't just been thoughtless or irresponsible. She'd been deliberately, systematically defrauding me and using my name to defraud others. I'd called my lawyer, Graham Richards, the next morning. Graham was a tough, no-nonsense attorney in his 50s who specialized in white-collar crime and financial fraud. I'd worked with him before on business disputes and knew he didn't pull punches. "Eleanor," he'd greeted me warmly. "Happy New Year. What can I do for you?" "I need to sue my sister," I'd said without preamble. There had been a pause. I see. What are the grounds? Fraud, embezzlement, identity theft, defamation, and probably a few other things we'll discover as we dig deeper. Send me everything you have, Graham had said, his tone shifting to professional assessment mode. I'll review it and let you know what our options are. I'd sent him Detective Miller's report along with my own documentation of every check I'd written, every payment I'd made, every expense I'd covered for Chloe over the past 5 years. Graham had called me back 2 days later. Eleanor, this is bad, he'd said bluntly. Your sister has committed multiple felonies. The charity fraud alone could get her serious prison time. Add in the identity theft using your name to secure loans from others, the potential tax fraud from not reporting the donations as income. We're looking at major legal consequences if we pursue this. Good, I'd said coldly. Are you sure you want to do this? Graham had asked carefully. She's your sister. This will destroy her life. And family lawsuits are messy. They're emotional, they're public, and they never really end. She destroyed her own life, I'd said. I'm just documenting it, file the suit. The lawsuit had been filed in February. Graham had gone for everything financial fraud, embezzlement of charitable funds, identity theft, defamation for using my name without permission, and a civil suit to recover all the money she'd taken from me and others. The local news had picked up the story in early March. Local woman accused of charity fraud, the headline had read with a subheading about how she'd allegedly stolen thousands of dollars donated in her parents' memory. The Denver Post had run a longer piece, including quotes from some of the people who'd donated to the fake charity. One woman had contributed $500 after her own mother had died suddenly, believing she was helping others in similar situations. When she'd learned the money had been used to fund Chloe's vacation in Cancun, she'd broken down in tears during the interview. The damage to Chloe's reputation had been swift and complete. Within days, her social media accounts had been flooded with angry comments. People she'd known from high school, from college, from her various jobs had all come forward with their own stories of how Chloe had borrowed money and never repaid it or manipulated them in various ways. A local TV station had done an investigative segment interviewing me for background. I'd been professional and unemotional, simply presenting the facts. Yes, I'd supported my sister financially for years. No, I hadn't known about the charity fraud until recently. Yes, I was pursuing legal action because I believed it was the right thing to do, not just for me, but for all the people she'd deceived. The clip had gone viral locally, then nationally. Reddit had picked it up. Twitter had been ablaze with hot takes. Some people had called me heartless for suing my own sister. Others had praised me for holding her accountable. I'd ignored all of it, focusing on the legal process. Meanwhile, Chloe's life had been falling apart in other ways. Mark had filed for divorce in April. According to mutual acquaintances, the fight that had started on Christmas Eve had never really ended. It had evolved into a constant bitter conflict about money, responsibility, blame, and betrayal. Mark had apparently finally realized that his wife had been systematically lying to him about where money was coming from. He'd believed the story that I was just generous, that I wanted to help. He hadn't known about the charity fraud, the loans from my colleagues, the extent of Chloe's deception. When the lawsuit had become public and he'd learned the truth, he'd felt betrayed not just on my behalf but on his own. His parents had been humiliated when their church friends had learned they'd been living in an apartment guaranteed by someone who was now suing their daughter-in-law for fraud. The divorce had been ugly. No assets to split since they had none, just debts. Chloe had moved out of the apartment unable to afford the market rate rent I'd implemented. Mark had moved back in with his parents, who'd also had to downsize to a cheaper apartment after I'd withdrawn my guarantee. The Davies family, which had once seemed so united in their casual exploitation of my generosity, had turned on each other. Richard and Patricia had blamed Chloe for destroying their relationship with their son. Mark had blamed everyone. Thomas and Amanda had distanced themselves from the whole situation. And through it all, I'd felt nothing. No guilt, no sadness, no regret. Just a kind of cold satisfaction that the truth was finally being revealed. But Chloe apparently wasn't done trying to manipulate me. The call had come on a Friday evening in May from a number I didn't recognize. I'd been at home actually enjoying a quiet evening for the first time in weeks. Work was going well. I'd met someone interesting, an architect named David, who made me laugh and never once asked me for anything. Life was beginning to feel normal again. When I'd answered the phone, I'd heard Chloe's voice, small and broken. Natalie. I'd almost hung up immediately, but something had made me stay on the line. Maybe curiosity about what she'd try next. Maybe just a desire to hear her admit defeat. Chloe, I need help. She'd been crying ugly sobs that would once have moved me to immediate action. Now they just sounded manipulative. Everything's falling apart. The lawsuit, the news coverage, Mark leaving me, I've lost my job, I'm being evicted, my friends won't talk to me, and I have nowhere to go. I'm about to be homeless, Natalie. Homeless. And, I'd said, my voice devoid of sympathy. And I'm your sister, she'd wailed. You can't just let me end up on the street. Please, I'm begging you. I'll do anything. I'll pay you back everything, I swear. Just please help me one more time. No. The word had been simple, final. What do you mean, no? Chloe's voice had risen, panic edging into anger. You have to help me, I'm family. You're not my family, I'd said calmly. You're someone who shares my DNA and who systematically exploited me for years while treating me with contempt. That's not family. That's a con artist I made the mistake of loving. I made mistakes, Chloe had screamed. I'm human. People make mistakes. You're supposed to forgive me. That's what sisters do. Actually, I'd said, what sisters do is support each other, respect each other, care about each other's well-being. You did none of those things. You just took and took and took, and when I finally showed up to my own property, you called me a parasite and told me to get out. I was drunk, she'd sobbed. I didn't mean it. Yes, you did, I'd said quietly. Alcohol doesn't create feelings, Chloe. It just removes the filter that keeps you from expressing them. You meant every word. You've probably felt that way for years. I was just too useful to risk alienating completely until you'd already secured everything you could from me. There had been silence on the line except for her ragged breathing. Do you remember when I called you? I'd continued, my voice steady and cold. In October, when I was having a crisis at work. When I was sitting in my office at 11 p.m. crying because I thought I might lose everything I'd worked for. Do you remember what you did? I don't... Chloe had stammered. You asked me for $400 for a spa package for Patricia's birthday, I'd said. You didn't ask how I was doing. You didn't offer support. You immediately pivoted to asking me for money. That's when I should have known what you really thought of me. But I gave you the money anyway because I was still hoping that someday you'd see me as a person instead of a resource. I'm sorry, Chloe had whispered. I'm so sorry. I was selfish and stupid and I took you for granted, but I can change. I can be better. Just give me one more chance. No, I'd said again. I don't believe you, and even if I did, it doesn't matter. I'm done being your safety net. I'm done being your backup plan. I'm done being the person you use until you've drained me dry and then resent for having boundaries. Please, Chloe had begged, her voice breaking. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to survive without you. Then I guess you'll have to learn, I'd said, just like every other adult in the world who doesn't have a sister funding their entire existence. I'll end up homeless, she'd screamed. Is that what you want? Do you want me to die on the street? Will that make you happy? What I want, I'd said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, is for you to take responsibility for your own life. What I want is for you to realize that actions have consequences. What I want is for you to understand that you can't spend years treating someone like garbage and then expect them to rescue you from the mess you created. You're a monster, Chloe had hissed, her desperation turning to venom. You're a cold, heartless monster who gets off on watching people suffer. No wonder you're alone. No wonder you'll always be alone. Who could love someone like you? You know what, Chloe? I'd said, feeling nothing but tired relief. I'd rather be alone than be used. I'd rather be a monster in your eyes than be a doormat under your feet. And honestly, I'm not alone. I have friends who actually care about me. I have colleagues who respect me. I have a life that I built through my own hard work, and it's a good life. The only thing that was making it miserable was you. I hate you, she'd sobbed. I hate you so much. I know, I'd said. You've probably hated me for years. But you kept that hate quiet because you needed my money. Now that the money's gone, you don't have to pretend anymore. I'd say that's almost honest of you. What am I supposed to do? Chloe had asked, her voice small and desperate again. I don't know, Chloe, and for the first time in 5 years, that's not my problem to solve. Maybe call a shelter. Maybe reach out to the Davies family you were so eager to celebrate Christmas with. Maybe get a job and start supporting yourself like the 32-year-old adult you are. But whatever you do, don't call me again. You can't just abandon me, she'd screamed. I'm your sister. Blood is thicker than water. I'd laughed, then a short, bitter sound. You know that's not the full quote, right? The actual phrase is, "The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb." It means that bonds formed by choice are stronger than bonds formed by biology. And Chloe, I'm choosing to be done with you. I'd hung up and immediately blocked the number. Then I'd poured myself a very large glass of wine, sat down, and felt nothing but relief. The lawsuit had proceeded through the summer. Chloe couldn't afford a good lawyer and had ended up with an overworked public defender who'd tried his best but was working with an impossible case. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Detective Miller had documented everything meticulously. In September, on the advice of her lawyer, Chloe had agreed to a settlement. She'd pled guilty to fraud and embezzlement charges, agreeing to 5 years of probation, 300 hours of community service, and restitution of $45,000 to be paid through wage garnishment from whatever job she could find. The civil suit had resulted in a judgment against her for the full amount I'd documented, over $500,000. I knew I'd never see most of that money, and I didn't care. The point wasn't financial recovery. The point was establishing legally and publicly that what she'd done was wrong. The charity had been dissolved, the few remaining funds distributed to legitimate grief counseling services in Colorado. The website had been taken down, the social media accounts deleted. Chloe's name was now permanently associated with fraud. A simple Google search would bring up dozens of articles about her case. Any potential employer, landlord, or romantic partner would find out what she'd done. Her reputation was destroyed. Her marriage was over. Her financial future was bleak. And I felt nothing but peace. Through all of this, I'd been rebuilding my own life. I'd thrown myself into work, taking on exciting new projects. The development deal I'd nearly lost had been successfully completed, and it had led to 3 more major projects. My reputation in the industry was stronger than ever. I'd also been spending more time with David, the architect I'd started seeing. He was kind, funny, successful in his own right, and had never once asked me for anything beyond my time and attention. We'd gone on real dates, had real conversations about our lives and dreams, and I'd felt myself slowly learning to trust again. Rachel had noticed the change immediately. "You seem lighter," she'd said over brunch one Sunday. "Like a weight's been lifted." "It has," I'd admitted. I finally cut off Chloe completely, and it's the best decision I ever made. Rachel had reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you. I know that couldn't have been easy." "The weird thing is it was easy," I'd said and meant it. The hard part was living with it for so long. Actually walking away, that was simple. I just had to decide I deserved better and then follow through. I had deserved better. I deserved to have relationships where I was valued, not just used, where I was seen as a person, not a piggy bank, where love was mutual and respect was fundamental. And now, nearly a year after that Christmas Eve confrontation, I have those relationships. I have friends who celebrate my successes and support me through challenges. I have professional connections based on mutual respect and shared goals. I have David who makes me laugh and thinks I'm wonderful exactly as I am. Most importantly, I have myself, my peace, my boundaries, my life lived on my own terms. Now it's been nearly a year since that Christmas Eve confrontation. I'm sitting in the cabin again, but this time it's spring. The aspens are budding, tiny green leaves just beginning to unfurl. The snow has melted except for a few stubborn patches in the shadows. The valley below is turning green wildflowers starting to dot the meadows. I'd come up here to celebrate. Not any particular event, just the simple fact of my own happiness. The lawsuit settled months ago. Chloe and I haven't spoken since that phone call. I have no idea where she is or what she's doing, and I've made peace with not knowing. My career is thriving. I closed the biggest deal of my life last month, a development project that will set me up financially for years to come. I'm seeing someone, a kind, thoughtful architect named David, who makes me laugh and never once has asked me for money. We're taking it slow, but I'm hopeful in a way I haven't been about romance in a long time. More importantly, I've learned to value my peace above all else. My home is my sanctuary, not a place anyone else can claim. My money is mine to spend or save as I choose, not an inheritance for someone who sees me as an obligation rather than a person. I've learned that love without respect isn't love at all. That family isn't defined by blood, but by how people treat you. That generosity is a gift, not a requirement, and that there's no virtue in being endlessly drained by people who see you only as a resource. Most of all, I've learned that walking away isn't giving up. Sometimes it's the bravest thing you can do. I stand at the window now, a glass of wine in my hand, not the expensive bottle Chloe wasted, but a local vintage I discovered at a nearby winery, crisp and perfect for a spring evening. The sun is setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Somewhere in the valley, an elk bugles the sound echoing across the mountains. This is my life now. No parasites, no users, no one treating my kindness like weakness. Just me, the mountains, the silence, and a future that finally belongs entirely to me. I raise my glass to my reflection in the darkening window. To new beginnings, I say out loud, and to never looking back. The wine is perfect, the view is stunning, and I am finally completely, blissfully free. Have you ever had to cut off a family member who took advantage of you? What was the breaking point that made you finally say enough? Drop your story in the comments below, and if this resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about setting boundaries and reclaiming your life. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is walk away from people who refuse to see your worth.